So let's talk about when God becomes a drug. So there was a woman who once wrote describing how she became really painfully aware of her addiction to religion and how it began to affect her life. And she wrote about her compulsive quoting of scriptural texts and her obsession with her own religious convictions. And that led to arguments with family and coworkers. And she described her eventual isolation from the people that she loved and her near bankruptcy that was caused by her excessive tithing. She wrote about how she tried to escape feeling lonely, angry, depressed, fearful, and guilty by increasing her religious activities. The more she pursued her obsessive religiosity, the more helpless and isolated she became. She tried numerous times to stop her compulsive behavior by not going so frequently to church, removing statues and crucifixes, etc. And she was in a treatment center where there was a spirituality group. And this woman's love-hate relationship with God is not uncommon. In in our work with people suffering from addiction, we undoubtedly run into people struggling with grievous issues related to their religious experiences. And these are people from all walks of life: lay people, Jews, atheists, agnostics, Buddhists, Muslims, New Age disciples, and even the 12-step junkies. They all share this common experience. In the name of God, they've been made to feel fear, guilt, shame, and anger. They've been emotionally, physically, and sexually abused, or they've abused themselves or others. And in the name of God, they brought themselves or other people on the edge of financial ruin. And they've been judged and condemned by others as worthless or inherently bad. So it's as a result, their unhealthy beliefs about themselves and God is poisoning their life. They use religion as a means to acquire power and control, especially to gain money or sex or both. Their only means of gaining self-respect and self-control is to lock themselves into these rigid, intolerant perfectionism, this harshly judgmental of others who doesn't follow their rules. And they use God or religion or their beliefs not to liberate themselves spiritually, but to escape that emotional pain. And eventually, their relationships are going to sicken. Their self-esteem is going to wither and die. And desperate to feel better, they're then going to fall prey to any substance, person, or belief that's promising relief to them. And this behavior creates an insurmountable barrier to authentic spirituality, and worse, to a healthy creative relationship with the inner power that I like to call God. See, shame fuels addiction. And more I've seen that much of the shame comes from dysfunctional religious beliefs. Dysfunctional religious messages about sin and sexuality and about God as an angry judge or cosmic fixer have created these toxic beliefs from which people have tried to escape by any means of addictive practices. So now we come to the point where modern Christianity holds that God, in the human form of Christ, came to bridge the alienation caused by Adam and Eve. It teaches that Christ is the only means to reunite with God and gain salvation. But it's unlikely that this was the original belief of Christianity. It came about as a result of tremendous changes in Christianity that occurred in the first 3 centuries of its existence. These changes involving the contemporary social and political climate. So the first Christians lived in a time of extreme economic and political and religious oppression and chaos. And even during Christ's ministry, there were differences of opinion regarding his role and his intent. Some of his followers believed he was going to lead a political revolt, and some saw him as a spiritual leader. And this difference of opinion led to many arguments and power struggles within the faith, and the debates are still raging today. And then gradually, these new interpretations of Christ's identity and the purpose of his mission on earth started to replace the original ones. Although he had once been seen as a mere mortal, a son of man who was adopted by God, Jesus is now seen as God in human form. God became man and then reascended to his throne. And this gave Jesus much more power and authority, and then by extension, gave that same authority for those who claimed to speak for him. So, to ease the disappointment that the second coming was not imminent, there emerged this notion of rewards. Not in this life, but in the next. So, the concept of a conqueror who could physically deliver oppressed people was abandoned in favor of a Messiah who brought them salvation in the next life, if they followed the rules in this one. And this gave the ruling classes a means of maintaining control without constant fear of revolt, and it allowed them to kind of salve their own consciousness about the abuses. And partly to justify this change and partly to soothe the oppressed, that tradition of the Messiah as the suffering servant, which is described in Isaiah, was restored. So for the poor, the Messiah was still one of them, a servant who was suffering just like them. And ultimately, this interpretation is what allowed Christianity to flourish, keeping it from just becoming some obscure and quickly forgotten sect of Judaism. And at the same time, it provided this foundation for new interpretations about the source of authority. Continuing that theme of adoption, the 4th century church used Paul's teaching, especially in Romans, to prove that the church had been anointed as the arbiter of conscience. So the scriptures were no longer the authority. The power now rested with the bishops as Christ's vessels. And this made the bishops divinely authorized to speak in the name of Christ. Only later came the concept of the Pope as Christ's vicar on earth. And these changes were firmly entrenched from then on. The itinerant teacher who referred to himself as the Son of Man had been transformed into the Son of God, the Savior whose sacrifice was the salvation of the world. And the message that would free the oppressed became, in the hands of the power-hungry, the means to keep them in submission. In a lot of ways, God and Christ now began to be used as weapons. So there was a lady that wrote in that she had become painfully aware of her addiction to religion and its effects on her life. And she wrote about her compulsive quoting of scripture and her obsession with her own religious convictions. And that led to arguments with family and coworkers. She described her eventual isolation from the people that she loved and her near bankruptcy that was caused by her excessive tithing. She said she tried to escape feeling lonely and angry and depressed and fearful and guilty by increasing her religious activities. And the more she pursued her obsessive religiosity, the more helpless and isolated she became. And she had tried numerous times to stop her compulsive behavior by not going so frequently to church and removing statues and crucifixes and incense burners from her home, not watching religious TV, hiding from members of her congregation, and not returning phone calls from her pastor, and even by canceling subscriptions for numerous religious magazines. And each time she realized that she was relapsing into more severe religious addiction, and that caused greater guilt and greater shame. And she finally sought out counseling and eventually entered a treatment facility where she could undergo religious detox in a safe environment. And today she's recovering from her religious addiction and is developing a healthier kind of spirituality. And what she described was this classic progression of addiction. We could substitute alcohol and cocaine or food, and the pattern would just be the same. And if I had any doubts about religion being addictive, like being used as a drug, letters like this one wash all of that away. Religious addiction does exist. It is a disease like any other addiction, and it can be treated and should be treated by the same methods that we use to treat other addictions. So we can define religious addiction as using God, a church, or a belief system as an escape from reality. It's an attempt to find or elevate a sense of self-worth or well-being. It's using God or religion as a fix. It is the ultimate form of codependency, feeling worthless in and of ourselves and looking outside of ourselves for something or someone to tell us that we are worthwhile. So it's an unhealthy relationship with God. It's using God, religion, or a belief system as a weapon against ourselves or a weapon against others. So, in a sense, religious addiction has very little to do with God or spirituality. Just as food addiction and alcoholism have less to do with those substances that are involved than with the way in which they are abused. Religious addicts use the accessory items of religion, like rituals and dogma and scriptural texts, to really reinforce the dysfunctional message that all humans are evil or stupid or incapable of merit. So, far from enhancing spiritual development, religious addiction really stunts or paralyzes spiritual growth, and it creates a barrier to that healthy relationship with God. The great lie of addiction and codependency is that something external beyond us is going to make life better. Something beyond us is going to make us feel good or acceptable or lovable and worthwhile. And the more we believe that an outside source is going to fix or rescue us, the more dependent that we grow on those outside external things to make us better. And this is specifically true for religious addicts, because most religious addicts believe themselves inherently worthless and powerless. So they look outside of themselves for some sort of religious authority who functions as a go-between and an intermediary who tells them that God is like, or tells them what God's like and what God wants them to do. So religious addicts never experience God firsthand, and they never truly get to know God. They only know what somebody has told them about God. If what they were told about God is dysfunctional, then their relationship with God becomes dysfunctional. And eventually this unhealthiness is going to, start to show. Just like other adult children of dysfunction are going to mirror the unhealthy beliefs and behaviors of people who are their role models, so the family of God reflects the dysfunctional messages and beliefs that are handed down from the religious go-betweens. Perhaps you've heard nutritionists say that you are what you eat. So similarly, religious addicts become what they believe. The God that they experience is reflected in their behaviors and their attitudes. Religious addicts feel judged by God, so they learn to judge. Religious addicts feel that God sees them as dirty and sinful, so they make others feel dirty and sinful. And religious addicts feel like the victims of God's whims, so they victimize and abuse other people. In religious addiction, as with other addictions, denial is going to run rampant. After all, the whole purpose of addiction is to escape from reality. So addicts will be looking for a way out. Religious addiction, just like alcoholism, is going to spring from this reservoir of low self-esteem, a sense of inadequacy, shame, guilt, and the desire to escape, fix, or numb these feelings. Often people say that they can see how religion can be unhealthy and dysfunctional, but they still cannot quite understand how it can be an addiction, much less a disease. And many of you might be familiar with the disease process of addiction. You might even be recovering from one or more addictions and want to see how you might be using religion addictively, or maybe have been religiously abused. For other people, this may be your first introduction to the concept of any addiction being a disease. So let's look at what addiction is, what its patterns are, and what makes it a disease. So there are a lot of excellent descriptions and definitions of addiction. Craig Nakin, a chemical dependency therapist and addictionologist, describes that as being a progressive relationship with either a substance or event that's designed to control the environment and or produce a desired mood or desired mood change. So he wrote this book called The Addictive Personality, and in it he says, Let's start with the basic assumption about most people. Nearly all human beings have a deep desire to feel happy and to find peace of mind and soul. At times in our lives, most of us find this wholeness of peace and beauty, but then it's as if it slips away and it's gone, only to return another time. In many ways, this is one of the natural cycles of life. It's not a cycle that we can control. Addiction can be viewed as an attempt to control these uncontrollable cycles. When addiction or when addicts engage in a particular object or event to produce a desired mood change, they emotionally believe that they can control these cycles. And at first they can. Addiction, on its most basic level, is an attempt to control and fulfill this desire. Wayne Oates, in The Psychology of Religion, expands on this when he describes obesity, alcoholism, and drug addiction as forms of nonverbal communication of rebellion against one's situation in life, or of protecting oneself from the unwanted responsibilities of life by incapacitating oneself through the compulsive use of food, alcohol, and drugs. These descriptions include the key elements of all addictions: control, escape, and progression. And much of addiction is about control. Many of us grew up amid the chaos of a dysfunctional home, and our addictions and compulsions have grown out of our attempts to make sense of or bring order to something that we never knew was beyond our control. So, never having learned how to express or cope with feelings appropriately, we fear them, and we go to great lengths to deny or avoid them. In order to win approval or escape abuse, we become people pleasers, overachievers, perfectionists, rigid and intolerant of our own or someone else's mistakes. Another way to control our situation is to just simply give up, become a victim of life. And we function under the illusion that we have no control over anything, that we have no choices in life. And we wallow in self-pity. We become passive. We allow ourselves to be controlled by others or by circumstances. We give our power away, incapacitating ourselves with the belief that we can't change. Our mottos, our excuses are, I can't. You just don't understand. Yeah, but this is what Eric Fromm means when he says addictions create a deterrent to an active change in reality. We believe we're helpless. Our addictions make this belief come true, and they create this self-fulfilling prophecy. Yet we rebel against this perceived lack of choice, against the perceived inability to take responsibility for our own lives. We're angry victims, and we're furious with a world that does not validate our sense of being a victim by indulging us in our self-pity, by fixing us or rescuing us. So in our victimization, we become passive-aggressive, or doormats that bite. Victims control others by using depression or always being the underdog, and by using underhanded aggression and covert manipulation to really get their way. So addiction is this process with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And no matter what substance or behavior that we abuse, there are certain phrases common to all. So addictionologists have long been using a chart used by E.M. Jelinek disease concept of alcoholism to illustrate this downward progression of addiction. So here I've included a chart showing a similar pattern for religious addiction. So in the first stage, the use of alcohol, food, religion, or whatever, it's pretty balanced. Social drinking, dining out with friends, or going to church, these are all part of our lives. The alcohol, the food, the church rituals, they're not the focus of our activities. In this stage, we're going to be putting in long hours at work to meet the important deadline. Fasting might be a part of our religious celebration or ritual. Or our friends might enjoy a beer and popcorn when we gather to watch videos. We enjoy doing these things. But somehow, the part of us which deep down doesn't feel good about ourselves gets confused about what's giving us pleasure. And we begin to associate alcohol with feeling more relaxed around people, crunching popcorn with relieving tension, church with feelings of belonging. And we don't realize that these things are giving the illusion that they make us feel better about ourselves. And that is what addiction does. It gives us false information, an illusion. We don't know that the need to drink is out of our fear of others, that our hunger pains stem from anger, that we overwork out of our sense of inadequacy, or that we're increasing our church activities more out of loneliness and guilt rather than a devotion to God. So what happens is that we get hooked because whatever we end up abusing at first seems to solve the problem. And alcohol does relax inhibitions and it makes us feel more comfortable. That rich piece of chocolate cake does taste sensuously comforting. Cocaine does numb the senses. It seems to bring an exhilarating feeling of power. Starving while others cluster around the donut table does bring you a feeling of control and superiority. And being in a relationship can make a person feel valued and special. So can a high paycheck. So joining a church does give us this sense of family and belonging, of being loved. And we become addicted because at first these things work. And they work so well that the addict in us wants more. More alcohol, more food, more money, more whatever. To be thinner, to have that better job, that special person, that special place in church. What happens is that the progressive search for a fix, that persistent need for control, it leads to increasing impairment and dysfunctional behaviors. And that's where the addiction begins. We grow to depend on that outside source. We have the illusion of being in control or of having found something to fix us. And in the middle stages of addiction, that focus shifts. Now we can't go to a party without having a drink, or several, before we leave the house. That way we're already going to feel loosened up, right? So we start avoiding places where there's no booze. We used to go out and eat with friends for the championship. Now the focus is the food. Will there be enough? Maybe we ought to eat something before we go, or make sure there's a snack waiting in case we're hungry when we get home. We're not newcomers at church anymore. We're not getting that special attention, so we do more. Join the choir, teach Sunday school, go on retreats, tithe more. But underneath it all, there's this growing urgency, a compulsion that says we must do more because we're going to start losing control. And that loss of control signals the loss of self. What Craig McKinn was calling the addict self begins to take over. The attempts to stop and the relapses are signs of the struggle between the healthy and addicted parts of ourselves. McKinn says that the addiction starts to create the very thing that we're trying to escape, which is pain. And thus begins this vicious cycle of trying to stop, then relapsing, then feeling increased guilt and remorse and fear, and a consuming shame and self-hatred when we go back out and do it again. Denial sets in. Something tells us that we're in trouble and we don't want to believe it. Our problems are someone else's fault. I don't have a problem, you're the one with the issue. We drink, we overeat because of our spouse, our job. And we start because we believe we're heavy. We're starving because we believe we're heavy. We think the scales are telling us this. even though our clothes are baggy and they're falling off of us. So if people avoid us because we're always preaching at them, it's their fault. They're just heathens, right? We don't need them anyway. Nobody understands how important our work is. Nobody else can do our job as well. So it goes deeper into that denial, deeper into delusion, deeper into pain, always the pain. The rationalizing and the justification, the denial, and the self-victimization get worse. We're angry, irritable, and we become increasingly abusive to family and friends and coworkers. We're either trying to stop the addiction and failing, or we're in such total denial that we see nothing wrong and we just keep doing more. And our lives grow steadily unmanageable, yet we still don't want to believe that we're addicts. We're still looking for someone else or something else to blame when we at least face the fact that it's the drinking, the eating disorder, the codependency, the religiosity that's causing our pain. When we can't deny it anymore, we still want to avoid responsibility. We want something or someone else to fix us and make us better. And we get stuck in hopelessness and despair that we're never going to get free, that we're powerless. Our lives are unmanageable and we cannot see any way out except to die or go crazy. So formerly, it was believed that all addicts must reach this bottom, this pit of despair, before any kind of help would be effective. But today we know that's not true. There are people who are recovering from addiction who recognized that they had begun the addictive cycle and sought help before they reached this lowest rung on the ladder. Nora Volkow talks about this in some of her videos. She's a lead researcher at NIDA, and she's saying these things like, the earlier on that someone gets treatment, the better their chances of success. And in most cases, what helps people to recognize their addiction and seek help is the increasing cultural acceptance of addiction as this progressive disease that can be arrested but not cured. So Newsweek, in a cover story on support groups, noted that there were something like 15 million Americans that were attending some kind of self-help or support group, and many of them were based on the 12 steps of AA. And there are those who still consider that such problems as overeating or compulsive shopping, compulsive sex, obsessive relationships, and extreme religiosity are immoral actions, irresponsibility, or just bad habits rather than addictions. And such compulsions are going to fit Nikin's definition of addiction as a relationship with something that we increasingly use to change our mood. And as Wayne Oates described, these behaviors are also ways in which addicts victimize and incapacitate themselves. So perhaps the people who object to addiction or compulsive behaviors being diseases don't really fully understand what is meant when they are labeled as such. And when we talk about addiction as a disease, we don't mean a virus or a germ, but rather a physical, mental, and emotional reaction that occurs in response to alcohol or drugs or codependency or the abuse of them or any other compulsive behavior. Addiction is often described as being a sign of dis-ease with life, of literally being ill at ease with ourselves. So the word dis-ease is the opposite of being at ease. And it signals pain and discomfort in our lives that causes physical, mental, or emotional problems. So no matter what the addiction, whether it's to food or alcohol, relationships, sex, or religion, emotionally you feel shame and low self-esteem, guilt, rage, inadequacy, and you're depressed and anxious. Maybe you're having panic attacks. You may well have an underlying organic depression or mental illness alongside your addiction. We call these co-occurring disorders. Substance abusers, anorexics, bulimics, and overeaters do physical damage to their bodies. And sex addicts may have contracted some sort of sexually transmitted disease. And all addicts, including codependents and gamblers, workaholics, and religious addicts, they suffer the physical effects of the stress, the backaches, the headaches, the irritable bowel syndrome, metabolic dysfunction, chronic fatigue, insomnia, and memory loss. Some battle stress-related diseases like asthma or hypertension. Any condition that produces such grievous physical, mental, and emotional symptoms might be properly called a disease. But some people still argue that addicts bring their ill health on themselves, that addiction results from willful misbehavior, what they label as sin. Is it sin? Is addiction truly a matter of bad habits or depraved behavior which can be modified or cured by accepting God? What if it is willful misconduct rather than a disease? How does that affect an addict's self-image and ability to change behavior? People respond quite differently when labeled as sick or sinful. In Loosening the Grip, a handbook of alcohol information, the authors Gene Kinney and Gwen Leighton observe that how we label something determines our expectations and treatment of it. So, labeling a bulb as either a tulip or an onion is going to affect whether we chop and saute or plant and water. Very different behaviors are associated with each. An error may lead to strange flavored spaghetti sauce and a less colorful flower bed next spring. Labeling ourselves as blotches on existence renders us powerless, and it leaves us no hope of change because it tells us that we're inherently bad. And if we are labeled as tulips, people are going to water us, nurture us, and be thrilled when we blossom. And if we're regarded as onions, people are going to hold their nose and run away because we're going to make them cry. So it is with labeling addiction as a disease rather than a sin. If we have a disease, we can recover from it. If we're immoral or depraved or misbegotten and generally bad people, that doesn't leave us much hope for change. So the objection to calling addiction a disease is that it offers a cop-out. It's an avoidance of responsibility. George Valiant, in the Natural History of Alcoholism, defends the disease model of addiction when he notes that having a medical explanation for their behavior often gives alcoholics hope that they can change. And more importantly, he points out that success in AA requires taking responsibility for one's recovery and for the past errors rather than avoiding it. And all addicts begin by engaging in behaviors that lead to or perpetuate addiction. Behaviors that may have been perfectly acceptable activities at the time. This is one of the arguments used by Jelinek in his landmark book, The Disease Concept of Alcoholism, pointing out that alcoholism often starts with social drinking. This is an activity that in American culture is acceptable and almost mandatory. If you show up to a party, you're expected to bring something, right? And that something is typically a bottle of wine. So Jelinek says that we cannot then call it self-inflicted or willful misconduct. We can consider other addictions in the same light, like eating as a national pastime, especially in churches. The Protestant work ethic is woven into America's national value system. Church membership is considered a vital ingredient of being an upstanding citizen. As Erich Fromm noted in looking for that nursing bottle to comfort us, we've become a nation of consumers of almost any substance or product. We're accustomed to being controlled or almost browbeaten into buying it. And we grow accustomed to being told, for example, come on, you can have just one piece of cake, or Just stay and have another drink. Or if you want to be of service to God, you have to pray for us and send us money to help us continue this mission. So poor coping mechanisms and other emotional or psychological factors are going to help to create genuine disease. And addiction begins in emotional pain. We hurt and only want something to make us feel better. That is not the willful misconduct of immoral people. It's the cry of souls in pain. One key to understanding the concept of addiction as a disease may be in making the distinction between acute disease and chronic disease. If we have an acute disease, we go to the doctor or into the hospital and we're taken care of until we're cured. That kind of sickness connotes a passivity, you fix me attitude. Yes, addicts would love to have that kind of disease, like the morbidly obese person who fervently wishes for, maybe a glandular disease that would excuse and justify the obesity. Or maybe they wish for a disease that will cause effortless weight loss. But a chronic disease does not go away. It may be arrested, but never cured. So with proper self-care, people with these chronic diseases like diabetes or asthma, they can live full and productive lives. And people with chronic illnesses have a responsibility to affect their own recovery and their continued well-being. They didn't deliberately catch the disease, but having gotten it, they can learn some healthy ways to live with it. So addiction begins as dis-ease, an inability to cope healthily with life. Unhealthy religious beliefs poison your life and left you feeling alone, alienated from your family, your friends, and most important, from God. People like Charles, whose story I'm going to tell you in just a minute, they write or they call or they go in person to tell therapists how they tried to use religion as a fix and only ended up in worse pain and despair. So, Charles was in the audience of one of Father Leo's appearances on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Father Leo's suggestion that some adult children escape into religion after growing up in an alcoholic home hit Charles like a thunderbolt. He could hardly wait to talk to Father Leo backstage. So, Charles is black and he grew up in Chicago in an abusive, non-religious home. He was the youngest child of alcoholic parents, and he spent his childhood enduring a nightmare of arguments and fights and beatings. And he had two older brothers, and often the three of them would huddle together at night for comfort and protection. So from his earliest days, Charles remembered embarrassment, fear, pain, and the dream of escape. He thought about suicide, and when he was 15, a friend took him to Mission Chapel, and the preacher's message was one that he longed to hear. He was loved. God loved him. Jesus loved him. And at 16, he gave himself to the Lord, and from that moment, he was hooked. He went to other chapels, churches, crusades, baptisms, Bible study groups. He traveled to hear the big-name preachers, and he watched the TV evangelists. He could never get enough of it. And he went beyond devotion and discipleship to a burning sense of mission. He wanted to create a better world, a better society, more loving families. But they had to be devoted to Jesus. He read the Bible and he learned all the scriptures and dogma. Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life. The Bible was the absolute literal word of God. Only fundamentalist Christianity was the truth. And his family grew tired of his preaching and they rejected him. So Charles took this message to others and he became active in a fundamentalist church in Southside Chicago. And that's where he met Anne, who he later married. And although she shared his beliefs, she did not practice her faith as rigidly as he did. She didn't read her Bible every day or pray before every meal or get high planning the next Christian mission or crusade. Church was a part of her life, not the purpose of it. And they fought constantly over religion. Charles thought that Anne's faith was lukewarm, and she thought that his faith was demanding and rigid and fanatical. And when she left, her parting words were, "Religion is like a drug to you." And so it was. As with other addicts, his drug, which was his narrow and rigid faith, often created conflicts with his employers, and he would frequently go on weekend crusades and not get back for work on Monday. And he was always preaching at his coworkers, proselytizing on company time. He told Catholics that the Pope was the Antichrist, and he told Jews that they were beyond salvation unless they accepted Jesus. His coworkers disliked him, and he was fired from a couple of jobs. So when he became depressed, his guilt grew, and he never felt good enough for Jesus. He was always trying to do more, say more, give more, be more effective, and convert more people, tithe more, be more perfect. And when he failed, he beat himself up emotionally. Along with the depression came those periods where he felt besieged by what he felt were impure thoughts of wanting sex and wanting to quit the religious life. The result was even more guilt and more shame. So about this time, this is when he attended the Oprah Winfrey Show, he started to look at his behavior in the context of his childhood. He heard that many children of alcoholics become compulsive, obsessive, and perfectionistic. Before he saw the show, he had thought that his problematic childhood had impaired his ability to live constructively with others. He'd been blaming his growing depression on his childhood and on his perceived failure as a Christian. So after hearing about the symptoms of religious addiction, he began to connect his pain and problems with his strict adherence to religion. He saw that he had become obsessive about his faith, but he thought that all good Christians had to be obsessive about Jesus. He recognized that he had real problems and emotional pain, especially in the areas of relationships. And despite his church activities, he had few friends. He slowly began to accept that his extreme religious practices had not only caused the divorce from Anne, but had also placed a wedge between himself and most people. Charles was isolated as any alcoholic that I've ever met. And then after a series of conversations with Father Leo, he was able to connect his escape into authoritarian religion with the abuse that he experienced in his childhood. So for years he had said that his brothers took drugs to escape their pain. And slowly he started to accept that Anne was right, that he was doing the same thing with religion. Religion was his fix. And he later began attending some support group meetings for adult children of alcoholics, and he thought about maybe attending some support groups for religious addicts. And maybe you recognize yourself in some of his story. You don't feel at ease with God or yourself or your relationships or your world. You use God, a church, a preacher, scriptural texts, TV evangelists, a holy message, a belief system, a guru, or maybe a mystical vision as a means to escape your discomfort. You discover in this dysfunctional use of religion that something outside of yourself makes you feel good, accepted, or powerful, and you get high on being saved. And you're hooked on a particular interpretation of the Bible, and you lack tolerance or charity and acceptance for those who don't share your same beliefs. And you're spaced out in your own fantasy world, and you avoid reality. God has become your drug of choice. You crave a belief in heaven that's going to take you away from this living hell. And you develop an impossibly high standard of personal purity to ensure redemption. And you become hooked as a true believer who must convert totally or be eternally damned. You need to be, your need to be special leads you to believe that your acceptance of God makes you superior to other people. And maybe you, like a large number of people who become religious addicts, or they've been religiously abused, maybe you grow up in this dysfunctional family environment. You've been neglected or abandoned or abused physically, mentally, emotionally, and sexually. And keeping alcoholism and this physical abuse, like sexual assault, a secret becomes second nature. You learn to hide your feelings in order to stay safe from the abuse. And growing up in the chaos of and the pain of these homes is naturally going to create the need to escape. And more than a few of you escaped into religion. You escaped to a God who would take you out of this painful world. And you escaped to a God who is gentle and kind and non-physical. And you escaped to a spiritual power who condemned your abusers to hell. And like other addicts, you did not set out to become addicted. You only wanted to feel better. And Charles' story and others like it is typical of what happens to people who enter or adopt an abusive, shame-based belief system, whether it's organized religion or one of these New Age organizations or even a 12-step group. A lot of people associate religious addiction and abuse with either fundamentalist faiths or with cults. But addicted people can take a perfectly healthy belief system and use it as a weapon against themselves or to escape their feelings. And we see this happen in 12-step programs where people will quote Bill W. and the AA guidelines, and they know the big book as authoritatively as religious addicts do the Bible. No faith or denomination or belief system is exempt from being used obsessively and addictively. So, for example, there was this one young lady who, she said, "Am I crazy? I don't know if I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing." Her 6-year-old daughter has this rare and possibly terminal disease, and this woman had joined the support group for parents and families of people with these illnesses. And she was hoping to find help in processing her grief and her fear and her rage that her child had to undergo that pain. And the group used a Course in Miracles as its focus. And she basically liked the message in A Course in Miracles, but she didn't embrace it fully because she was just looking for support, not a religion. And she found herself being humiliated and belittled and told that she wasn't doing it right and it wasn't good enough. The group members were controlling, intolerant, and critical, and she was met with this rigid one-way approach, which appalled her, especially when she was told that not accepting all the teachings in the Course in Miracles might cause her child to die. She had been reared in an abusive religious family, so as an adult, she had really carefully avoided those rigid dogmatic churches, and she didn't expect to encounter this similar abuse in a support group. Instead of the healing and the comfort, she now is finding more shame and rage than she had ever experienced in her life. Her issues were real, and it's agonizing to watch a child suffer, and more so to know that the child might die. And she needed to know it was okay to be angry at God, that her grief and fear and rage were absolutely natural, and she needed validation and support, not guilt and shame. Was she crazy? No. She was absolutely correct in identifying addiction and abuse. This group had taken a belief system and turned it into this rigid, authoritarian dogma. The use was dysfunctional, not the belief themselves. The messages contained in A Course of Miracles was being used not to enlighten and heal, but to gain that power and control and to abuse. And that's an unhealthy use of a belief system. That is religious abuse. So this story emphasizes the fact that religious addiction and abuse are not just confined to the churches, and people can take a healthy belief system and use it in an unhealthy manner, usually with this dogmatic rigidity that doesn't permit any kind of questioning or personal choice or freedom. So we see the people who come to these 12-step programs who never question their sponsors. They memorize the big book and the related materials without really understanding what they mean. And we see people whose sponsors or therapists are rigid, authoritarian, controlling, and shaming. And most of these people are unable to end these abusive relationships because they don't dare challenge the authority figure who supposedly knows the answers. The biggest single hallmark of an unhealthy belief system is a written or unwritten rule that forbids you to think for yourself, to doubt or question the beliefs and practices. What then is a healthy spirituality? How do you get through the layers of guilt and shame and dysfunctional messages and beliefs to a spirituality that frees you to become positive, creative human beings? First, you have to recognize that you are not spiritually healthy. If you don't like yourself, if you believe you aren't good enough for God, that you're a lost sinner and God is going to somehow raise you up and make you better, you're not spiritually healthy. You diminish your ability to be positive and to be a creative human being if you're addicted to anything, including God or a belief system. So the first task is accepting that your belief system and your relationship with God are dysfunctional, and by doing this, you can open yourself up to this new concept of spirituality. So what does spirituality mean? It's kind of related to the word spirit. Not this child's concept of this white-sheeted Holy Ghost flying in and out of our lives, but an inner attitude that really emphasizes energy and creative choice and a powerful force for living. It's a partnership with a power that's greater than ourselves, a co-creatorship with God, if you will, that just allows us to be guided by God and yet take responsibility for our lives. And when we hear references to a spirited debate or to our national spirit, we immediately envision vitality and strength and pride. And we associate spirit with positive and creative energy. And this energy gives us this power to live and work and create. Spiritual people are positive and creative human beings. And they know deep inside themselves that they have this power to create the difference in their lives. They have looked within and found what can be called their best life and their yes to life. And this yes is going to shine forth in their attitudes and their actions. So recovery for religious addicts and those who have been religiously abused begins when they become able to appreciate the concept of the big God, discovering God within the happenings of ordinary life, allowing God to be involved in the everyday choices that they make. Recovery for religious addicts means discovering divinity in one's own life. It's the ability to see the miracle, see the gift, not as something God gives to us, but something we create with God. Many of us think of God as the creator without really understanding what that means. God created the world and continues to create in and through our lives, in our relationships, our activities, the way that we use our minds and our hearts. We are co-creators with God, not puppets on a string just waiting for something to happen. We make things happen. We create the difference, not in our old dysfunctional pattern of isolated control, but in choosing a partnership with our higher power, however we define that entity. It's our determined choice. The miracle exists. This is our yes to God. Recovery from a religious addiction and abuse is a process. We first accept that we need to change our beliefs and behaviors. Then we learn the symptoms, that which we need to change. Then we learn how to make the changes, discovering what tools we need and how to use them. And this is how we ourselves become somebody who can fix us. In recovery, we appreciate that we are powerful human beings. In that appreciation lies healthy spirituality and a rich, rewarding relationship with God as we now understand God.